He was a guest on the Carol Burnett Show before he became a regular. I'm Richard.
And I'm Gary, and these are our incredible stories. Hello and welcome back to all of our listeners from around the world and across the United States. We are so happy to have you back with us again today for some more incredible stories. Folks, we're so happy that you're here. And if you happen to be new, welcome to our show. Guess what? If you decide that you like our stories, you can hit that subscribe button. And then every Friday, you will be treated to some incredible stories. And today, we're going to be talking about one of the funniest men on TV in the mid-'70s and '80s. Started out with the Carol Burnett Show, did a lot of stuff, and was partners with, was it Harvey Korman?
He was.
And so we're so excited to share that story today. Take it away, Dad. Tell us a little bit more about who we might be talking about.
Okay, I'm going to back up just a second. And you mentioned, Gary, that our podcasts are free. I got a report from somebody that on some of the platforms, they're actually charging to hear our platform. So, folks, if you're paying money to hear our podcast, you might want to check and see if you could find us on a different platform, because we are free on all of the major platforms, right, Gary?
That is correct. If you go to Spotify, or if you have a Amazon account, or if you like to listen on Google or iHeartRadio, I mean, there's a lot of free things. If you have Alexa, you can listen to us there completely free.
Yep. So that settled. You did mention the funny man, Tim Conway, and we do have your sister, Amber, as a guest with us once again this evening here in the studio. Welcome, Amber.
Thank you for having me back.
Oh, it is our pleasure indeed. I'll make one slight correction. Tim Conway didn't get his start on the Carol Burnett Show. He goes all the way back to the 1960s, when he started as a guest on something called the Gary Moore Show.
He did. I was about to say that. You took the words out of my mouth.
And you know what? Gary Moore Show, I used to watch that sometimes as a kid. And one of my favorite people on that show was a guy named Durwood Kirby. He was the comedian on that show. And so I remember the Gary Moore Show from the 1960s. So, Amber, what do you know about Tim Conway's early beginnings?
So I know before Carol Burnett, and let me just start off by saying I'm a total diehard Tim Conway fan. He is one of my absolute all-time favorite comedians. He was also on the Steve Allen Show, as well as McHale's Navy. And as you mentioned, yes, he was on the Carol Burnett Show. He was a frequent guest before they even considered, it didn't even cross their mind for a while, to actually have him as a permanent cast member on the Carol Burnett Show.
In fact, it took 7 years.
It did. But let me tell you something. I delight in watching the reruns all the time. It never gets old.
So good.
I actually had the privilege of seeing him live at the Peabody before he died.
Here in Daytona.
In Daytona. And let me tell you something. The man is just as funny in person as he was on screen, if not funnier.
Oh, I don't doubt
So,
that.
larger-than-life personality, and he didn't have to try to be funny. It just came naturally, and I think it came from his upbringing of how he grew up. He was the son of an Irish orphan and a Romanian mother, who was also technically an orphan, and she never really learned to speak English, and the father never learned to speak Romanian. Father didn't say much, but the one phrase Tim's mom learned early on was to say, "I like hot fudge sundae." So she ate a lot of hot fudge sundaes.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
There's nothing like a hot fudge sundae.
Right? And if that's what you got to learn, the phrase, that's not such a bad phrase to learn. Yes, he didn't want to be a comedian originally. He did not set up to be a comedian. He wanted to be a horse jockey. And he did try his hand on it, but staying on the horse proved to be hard, and he had a phobia of horses. So probably not the best career choice to go into if you have a fear of the animal that you're supposed to be riding. And as Tim pointed out, people who put money on those horses aren't so happy when the horse comes around and the jockey's not on them. So, and that was a short-lived career for Mr. Tim. Tim's father was what they called a whip back in Ireland, and had a real hard time in Chargan finding a job as a whip. So he ended up working at a
What is a whip?
Club. I guess from my understanding, they kind of work with animals and stuff, hunting dogs or whatnot. So he ended up helping to groom horses at the Chargan Polo Club. And Tim was born an only child. And Tim likes to say that he thinks that he was so perfect that they didn't want to take any chances of making a mess up by having another child. So they just stuck to the one. That
makes sense.
So growing up, Tim had no cousins and no relatives other than mom and dad to be around. They did attempt one time to go see his father's sister. I believe her name was Maggie. And like I said, when they came over from Ireland, they were both orphans when they left and orphans when they arrived. And Maggie didn't really want to have any connection to the family. So the one time Tim and his then wife attempted to go visit her, she wouldn't even come down to the door. So he thought maybe she would like a TV and decided to go purchase her a television, only she wouldn't come down to collect it. And when they got home, when they left, they got a notice from the Sears and Roebuck that the TV had been returned and that the money had been credited back to his account. So, again, no connection to relatives. He did have childhood friends growing up, which is good. He led a very interesting childhood. They moved around a lot, but not in a great distance. In fact, some of the times that they moved, it was walking distance, so they would carry the furniture down the street. So,
wow, that saves money on a truck.
Right. The one job they had, Tim thought that they were rich. Kids, we don't know better. They lived on a property in what was referred to as, quote, unquote, a cozy cottage of a gentleman who was kind of a big deal in the polo community for that hunt club. And his dad's job was to groom the horses. They did fox hunting and they did polo, and his dad took care of the animals, and in doing so, and his mom did housekeeping. And so they got to live on the property. And so Tim was living high on the horse, if you will. Living there, he didn't realize that money was tight. He was just a kid enjoying it and referred to himself as a little prince. He had a lot of instances in his life that we would deem humorous, and he himself deems humorous. Again, I said, remember, there was no family growing up other than mom and dad. And when he was baptized or christened at the church, there was no family to stand in as witness, so they pulled a custodian or a janitor over to witness. And in the process, he was 4 months old, by the way, because he was a really colicky baby. In the process of doing the ceremony, nobody noticed that he had gone missing. They get halfway through the ceremony, and his father says, "He's risen." And the priest looks down and says, "He's dropped." And the janitor says, "Yes, he rolled off the pillow and under the table." So the janitor had to get down on all fours and get the baby and put him back onto the pillow, anchored his ankle, mom anchored his arms, and the ceremony proceeded. Yes. So that was an infancy. So you can only imagine how life went on with that, having such interesting parents. Again, strong Romanian mother, silent Irish father, and again, moving quite a bit. Within a short period of time, they might be in a place for about a year or so, and then they would move like maybe down the street a block away or 16 miles. They moved about 3 times, I think, before they find their permanent home where he finished his grown-up years. Because they liked to save money. Money was tight. But his mom would do the same ritual every time they moved. She would take her foot pedal sewing machine, make the curtains for the house, and then she would go to the local hardware store with Tim and Tote and buy wallpaper. And she refused to pay the extra money for the paste, so she would get Pillsbury flour and water and Tim and her in a bucket and stir it, and that was the wallpaper paste. And it was all well and good until the weather got cold and the furnace would heat the house, and you would hear the cracking and the peeling, and they would wake up the next morning to peeled wallpaper, and they would have to replace it, which they did repeatedly over and over again. But that was her method. The last pattern of wallpaper she picked, it was horses jumping over a fence with hunting dogs behind them, but the house they were living in was a refurbished garage, and the walls weren't even, and so hanging wallpaper with a heavy pattern, as you know, if the walls don't meet up and the pattern's heavy, they had horses colliding into each other, going in different directions and whatnot, so it became kind of a thing of interest for Tim to bring over his buddies from school to show them the awkward hanging wallpaper or whatnot.
You know, he had a lifelong hobby of sewing. He could actually sew anything like a new suit to reupholstered furniture. And so I have to think that goes all the way back to his mom getting that sewing machine.
Absolutely, because of her being an immigrant and them having to work for everything. He attributed the sewing to her bad knee later in life because everything was handmade. But I do agree, because he was known as being quite the seamster later in life. And in fact, he made a lot of costume pieces or whatnot, as they talk about later on. Very handy. He said he learned everything he needed to know from his mother before going into school. Hey, why did I need to go to school, he said. But he did go to school. In fact...
Oh, did he?
Boy, did he ever.
Yeah,
he went with style.
Yep.
Yeah, Tim, he was quite the man.
Took him 11 years to get through college, folks.
Oh, wow. That sounds like my college career right now.
And when asked about it, he would tell people, well, I was a slow learner.
Yeah. Amongst other things. I think he convinced them at one point he was a master chef, and he was selling egg salad out of the dorms to try and make money for another scheme he was up to. And when the fraternity got the bill for the boiled eggs, he was quickly put back to dish boy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He also enlisted in the military for a short stint.
Yes, but before he did that, Amber, I have a little incident from his stint there at Bowling Green State University.
That wouldn't be the car chassis stint, would it?
No, you'll have to tell us about that.
Oh, that's one of my favorites.
But you were mentioning that, he was pretty innovative in getting money. And he belonged to a fraternity, and his fraternity brothers in the Newman House, which was the Catholic social club, he'd MC their events.
This is true.
He'd MC their events, and... what he'd do is he'd gather about 15 jokes.
Yep.
He'd gather up 15 jokes. He'd learn those jokes, and then he'd tell those same jokes every Friday night at the Newman pizza parties. Every Friday night, the same 15 jokes, and then he dined for the rest of the week on the leftover pizza.
That's true. That is true. Yep.
Yeah. But then he moved to comedy sketches on the campus radio station, and then we bring it back up to where you were going with 2 years in the Army, and that is where he decided to become a comedian.
And, his name starting out was not Tim Conway, it was Toma. It was only later in showbiz that Toma became Tim, because Tim was easier to say than Toma. Toma is what his mother named him. But, talking back about his joke telling and whatnot and different ways he made money, he had a number of jobs to pay for stuff while in college. In fact, when mom and dad scraped the money to get him to college to Bowling Green, he left with $50 in his pocket to get to school. And so he swore up and down he would pay his mom and dad back for the money they'd put for him to be able to go to school in the first place. And I think some of the jobs he had were interesting. One of his buddies from the fraternity talked him into buying a set of aqua lungs, and him and his buddy went to a nearby golf course and stripped down to their shorts, and their job was to scoop out the golf balls from the bottom of the lake and resell them to the pro shop by the pound, I guess it was. That was short-lived. And then one of my absolute favorite stories of a job that he probably should have passed up on maybe, but, it wouldn't have been as exciting to tell his story, was this car chassis scheme. Tim was always looking for a way to make a buck, and let me go back to saying he was the only one in this one who did not have a driver's license at the time. So he was just now in driver's ed at this point, but he was so eager to make money that he never turned down a job. He agreed, him and some buddies, buddies from high school, not from his fraternity, I'm sorry, to meet up at a Greyhound bus station and drive from Detroit to Pittsburgh, 24-hour trip with a group of college kids. And they gathered at 5 in the morning at this place called Cecil's Garage. It sounds like the perfect name for a garage, right? And they piled into this Oldsmobile. That sets the time frame for you. And they took off on a 5-hour drive in pouring rain. I mean, pouring, did not stop. They made 2 stops for coffee and bathroom breaks. And they get to this garage. And when he gets there, he realizes he's just driving a car chassis back. And when I say car chassis, folks, I mean just a metal frame, right? There's no windshield. There's no seats. There's no seat belts. There's nothing. It's literally just a steering column, a frame, the tires, and an engine or motor to make it run. And again, that beautiful weather we were talking about, that blowing rain. And they gave him an orange crate to sit on and an inflatable cushion. Orange crates have nails. Can you imagine what happened with the cushion and the nail? That's right, it deflated. So he ended up on a 24-hour road trip riding, as he said, his back end was petrified by the time he got to where he was going, soaked to the skins. He ended up having to take the jacket he had with him and using that for a cushion to ride on, which meant he got completely drenched. And he got all the way back to where he was going, and it wasn't worth the money. He didn't make a whole heck of a lot, but it made for a great story later.
Mm-hmm. He was delivering the chassis to somebody, I assume.
He was. Well, there were 5 of them, so it was him and his buddies.
Okay.
But they didn't get back home till like 2 a.m. in the morning, and I think he only made $20 for that whole thing. Yeah.
But you know, this is a rags to riches story, and so Tim Conway knew how to do what he had to do to cobble a few dollars here and a few dollars there and make things work.
He did. And as I went on to say, after he did finish, he graduated in 1956, and he enlisted. He said the reason he thought he enlisted, he just couldn't fathom the idea of going back to the bosom of his loving, quote-unquote, loony family. And he wasn't really sure what to do with his life, so he decided to listen into the military. And the night before he was to leave, his mom and dad threw kind of a shindig of people to say goodbye to him, which wasn't really their style. Usually if people came over and they didn't want him around, and they heard him coming up the gravel road, his mother had a code word she'd yell out, and the whole family would go under the kitchen table and pull the tablecloth down and wait till 5 minutes until everybody left and they heard the gravel on the road before they would come out to make sure that they didn't have company. But in this case, they threw a shindig, and he went to bed early. He got up at 6 a.m. the next morning, loaded the bus at the bus station to get to military base or whatnot. Well, he was a whole day early and got returned home. And his mom said, why are you home so soon? He said, I'm on leave, Mom. She didn't understand what that was. And anyways, he loaded up the following morning and went back out to where he needed to be. But that was Tim for you.
And then he probably felt good about having, being taken care of in the military, food, housing, and a regular salary. So that probably was the first time in his life where he experienced that kind of security.
Oh, I'm sure.
You know, he was known to be loyal to his friends all through his life, and he never said a bad word about anyone. So you know what? This is the kind of person you want to see succeed in life. And so I think we're ready now to find out how indeed he really succeeded. Let's talk about his television career.
So he started out in McHale's Navy, and that was back before Technicolor. So I guess the fan base for McHale's Navy wasn't as big as it could have been, being black and white as opposed to Technicolor, but I believe that changed up. He had one character on there that he did the role of, and trying to think of the name of the person. I cannot think of his name at this moment.
That's okay.
To forgive me, I have a ton of notes of Mr. Conway here, but he
Let's in any event, we can continue on with his story.
He did a lot of shows. In fact, he had his own show before the Carol Burnett show, the Tim Conway show, and you used to be able to pick up the DVD set at Cracker Barrel, as I have, and he had a character on there called Dag Nash. It was a race car driver. And it was just him and a microphone and the different sound effects or whatnot, but he really pulled his audience in with that.
And then probably his biggest accomplishment was 11 years connected with Carol Burnett.
Not only biggest accomplishment, but a lifelong friendship.
Yes.
Carol and her husband and Sharky, Tim's wife, what a lovely name, and Tim became lifelong buddies. And their families traveled together, and they did all kinds of stuff. Very much family people on both sides. And so, and actually, if you read this book, Carol does the foreword in this book. And she talks about her first time meeting Tim and her impressions on Tim.
The name of the book is?
It's called Tim Conway. What's So Funny?
Tim Conway, What's So Funny?
What's So Funny? And then below it says My Hilarious Life. So.
I've read that Carol Burnett absolutely adored him.
So here's a little fact that not a lot of people, unless you're a diehard fan of the Carol Burnett show, as I am, know. But Tim and Carol got along way better than Harvey and Carol did. Harvey was kind of not the easiest fellow to get along with.
This is Harvey Korman.
Harvey Korman. Now, him and Tim would play off each other beautifully. They've done some wonderful skits. But behind the scenes, he was kind of a demanding person and kind of like things his way and wasn't real flexible.
This is Harvey.
This was Harvey. And Carol had basically said to him, either straighten up or you're out. And Tim came along like a breath of fresh air and was totally opposite, and they just clicked. And the way the show was done, they had a scripted, this is what we're doing, where they would sit down with the cast and they would go through their scripts, and that was what they would do. But then Tim being Tim, he would get permission to do things his way and ad-lib. And most of the time, Tim's ad-lib was the one that was recorded and broadcast and not the scripted thing, because Tim's was so much funnier. Tim and Harvey, Carol, and Vicky had a routine joke between them, and that was to see who could crack or who could stay along in character without cracking from Tim. And Tim's job was to get them to come out of character. And if you know to look for this in the episodes, it doesn't take long for Tim to knock somebody out of character to where they completely forget what they're doing.
Carol Burnett said, when Tim got on a roll, it was impossible to keep a straight face and not break up.
Yes, there are many
And this
episodes.
is Carol Burnett.
Yes, there are many, and she's a very trained actress. I
Yeah,
mean, she
and
knows
she's a
her
comedian
role.
in and of
She
herself.
is, and if you can break Carol,
Then you're something.
yeah, and he did. I think every one of them fell victim to laughing at him.
And they had actually a rather structured routine that you're talking about there. It wasn't kind of just haphazard. They actually planned each and every episode to do 2 tapings before 2 different audiences.
Right.
So they would tape both of them on Fridays, different audiences. The first one would be as rehearsed, as scripted. Mm-hmm. Then they'd get the second audience in, and that's where lots of improv and, things were added. And the last could go on from 4 to 10 minutes. And so most of the time, as you mentioned, it was the second one that made the air because it was
And
so
Tim
hilarious.
was going for a laugh. And so Tim would do everything he could to go for, and some of them, I can watch them 100 times, and it's just as funny the 100th time as it was the first time seeing it. Mm-hmm. One of his most notable sketches that he did for the Carol Burnett show was The Dentist. Mm-hmm. And Harvey Korman, of course, is your straight-laced, straight-faced patient, and sweet old Tim is the clumsy, klutzy, new-to-the-scene dentist, and misfires with the Novocaine and numbs his own hand before trying to do the root canal, and one thing leads to another, and before you know it, it's just this complete, utter mess. But you're laughing so hard that you just can't even see through your tears.
Oh, I know it. I've seen some of those episodes you're referring to. They are hilarious.
I also love his oldest man sketches where he's, the oldest fireman or he's the oldest doctor or whatnot. I mean, just his determination and dedication to his character. I mean, he really poured himself into his roles. Like, he really felt his roles. It was just...
He did a few movies, too.
He did. I think he was part of the Apple Dumpling Gang.
Apple Dumpling Gang, Shaggy D.A.
Right, yeah.
He did Speed too.
Yeah, and The Private Eyes with Don Knotts. And, of course, Don Knotts is one of my favorite funny men.
Right.
And so, can you imagine Don Knotts and Tim Conway together?
Oh, my goodness. How would you keep a straight face? I wouldn't even be able to stay on
you'd be rolling in the aisles throughout the entire thing. I don't even know who I love better.
Yeah. Both of them together would just be the best.
Yeah, and they had such facial expressions, too.
They did, both of them. Yeah.
Well, I think Amber, his like I say, his is a rags to riches story.
It is.
And we're so thankful that it is, because he was certainly a deserving person. Like I say, not an unkind word toward anyone. Get along with everyone, which is hard to do in just about any job, but in the TV and movie industry especially.
And he stayed humble.
Yeah.
How many people in Hollywood can you say that stay humble and, remember where they came from? He was a proud grandfather, too. And as you mentioned, he sewed stuff. He made stuff for his granddaughters all the time. Just he loved family and people and just being and entertaining.
I've got a piece of his advice on how to bring up kids, which we can share with Gary.
Oh, please do tell. I'm dying to find out.
Okay, Gary, listen to this. I'm going to give you a direct quote now from Tim Conway. I don't think toy companies ever made anything as wonderful as a cardboard box.
Ooh,
Oh,
so
that
true.
you know what though? I already know that one.
You can turn it into a house. Kids can crawl inside with a flashlight. You can paint pictures on the side. You can cut out the windows. Now, Gary, you have a 3-year-old toddler, Oliver.
He loves cardboard boxes, and that's something I have always said myself. So I think that's just something that goes along with people who have a very active imagination, because we have turned cardboard boxes into submarines. We have turned it into the Ghostbusters firehouse. We have turned them into race cars and spaceships and a portal to Toyland and all sorts of other things. And sometimes he just wants the box so he can jump out of it and scare the living daylights out of mommy. So, I mean, Oliver, not Tim Conway, but
But you know, Tim Conway was pretty wise character when it came to knowing what kids wanted and what would benefit kids with that statement.
well, you know what? I
He
think
was spot on.
the thing is that some of us never grow up. We're a kid at heart. We, grow up and have to do grown up things, but
Never completely
keep
grown up.
that childlike sensibility, and that really does translate.
I think Tim
translate
Conway
well.
had that.
I think he did that beautifully, and I know for myself, I've tried to bring some of his beliefs or notions into imagination play with the summer jobs that we do. We've always done this thing up until this past summer called Destination Imagination, and it's allowing little ones to use the very basic things around them and put their imaginations to use. Gary would build a box, and that box becomes an airplane, and Gary becomes the pilot. And it's almost like the No Frills Airline sketch with Tim, Harvey, and Vicky and Carol, and they're on the airplane. And, the kids are forced into this imagination to where they start believing, and they have so much fun because they're so, so used to seeing stuff in print in front of it. It has to be black and white. But with your imagination, limitless possibility. I mean, we just wrapped up another year of summer camp, and the most popular area were the areas where the kids were using cardboard boxes and imagination and just the ability to use your voice and create a story and all this other stuff, thinking outside the box. It's just, it's awesome. And it's such a gift, and for Tim Conway to
Be the first to publicize it.
Right.
He was
there's
the
something
first
to
one
it.
to say, "Hey, this is better than anything the toy manufacturers
And
can
I
make."
would have to agree, and I think humans aren't the only ones that get it. I saw a little cartoon with a cat in a box. Person had gotten this beautiful cat tree out of the box, and the cat would rather have the box than the cat tree. So even animals get, the ability to have something so simple be so much fun. And I love the clean humor of them. And Carol Burnett, it's funny without being too edgy, And it's timeless. It doesn't matter that it was
That's very
1960s,
true.
1970s, and here we are in 2022. It's just as funny and relevant now as it was when you were younger.
Well, on that note,
Younger, he was in his 30s when that show was
Again,
on.
younger. He was younger.
on that
Youngish.
On that note, I'm going to recommend that our listeners find an episode of The Carol Burnett Show and watch Tim Conway at his funniest.
I think I'll do just that. Thank you for the invite. I'm getting my popcorn and my chair ready now.
There you go. Hey, Gary, I'm Richard.
And I'm Gary, and that's Amber, and this was a very incredible story. Join us again next time for more incredible stories.